So the world has a problem. We're not having enough kids, especially in the richest of countries. And this is something that could have huge effects for our economy, our society, and our future. Here's the really crazy part. No one seems to agree on what's really causing this decline or even what we should be doing about it. Last year, the US fertility rate hit an all-time low of 1.62 births per woman. That's the lowest birth rate since the government started tracking this statistic in the 1930s. But back in the 50s, the fertility rate was about 3.7 births per woman. And you need at least 2.1 births just to keep the population steady. And it's not just the US dealing with this problem, it's the entire world. Countries like Japan, Italy, Germany, they're all seeing similar drops. Italy has actually declared a national state of emergency because their birth rate is so low. But it gets even worse when you zoom out and you look at the global picture. Population growth is projected to flatline by the year 2100. And in some countries, it's already happening. South Korea's fertility rate, for example, dropped to 0.72 in 2022.
Yeah, that's
the
bad.
lowest in the world. To put that in perspective, that's less than half of what's needed to maintain a stable population. So if this trend keeps on going, South Korea could see its population cut in half in just a couple generations. So the other question is, what's causing people to have less kids? And this is where things get a little tricky. Some argue that it's because women have more freedom and more women are pursuing higher education and careers. And as a result, they're waiting longer to have kids, or they're choosing not to have them at all. And some people say it's the rise of dinks or dual income, no kids households. Some people argue it's the decline of religion or the decline of fertility rates thanks to the chemicals and pesticides that's in our food. But regardless of what the real reason is, the outcome's pretty bad. And as someone who wants to be a parent someday, I just want to know what's causing this to happen, and I also want to know how expensive is it to really become a parent? And how much is it going to cost our future if we stop becoming parents? One US study asked people between the ages of 18 to 49 why they didn't want to have kids, and 56% said they just didn't want to. The other half said it was for a variety of different reasons, like medical, financial, having no partner, age, climate change, or their partner just didn't want to have kids, and generally the state of the world.
Wow, that research is from 2021 too, meaning that's fairly recent. Pew Research is pretty reputable too. I would have expected that to be way higher on the some other reason side of the chart there, and not over 50% just because I don't want to. That's nuts.
One really surprising reason that kept showing up throughout all the different studies that I looked at across all the different countries was that trouble finding a partner was at 15% of the people surveyed, which is really weird considering the average person spends almost an hour a day on their dating apps. It's now a lot easier than ever before to meet people thanks to apps like Tinder, POF, Bumble, eHarmony, and apps like that. But people also say, despite how easy it is to get a date, it's becoming a lot harder to find a partner for the long term to have kids with, and one of the reasons why is because of the very same technology that was supposed to help us. In fact, Pew Research found that 75% of the people they polled said it was either very or somewhat difficult to find someone in the past year, either because they had trouble approaching them or that person didn't meet their expectations, all of which led to a burnout for a variety of different reasons that I'm sure most of us experienced at some point.
You know what I kind of realized with the whole dating problem that a lot of people have in their 20s is that everybody's expectations are very high, which that's okay to have, very strong expectations for what you want out of a potential life partner, right? That's your biggest investment is who you marry. However, a lot of people are not also on the other side going, you know what? I need to be the best version of myself. I need to, be a really humble, awesome, developed individual spiritually, whatever. I need to be somebody who's making good financial money. I need to be somebody who's physically fit. I need to be somebody who's charismatic and funny. I feel like people's expectations are enormous, but then the amount of time that they spend developing themselves and focusing on, how can I actually be better and do better, don't always match up.
So that's one major reason why people aren't having as many kids, but there's another big reason: money. I wanted to know, how much does it cost to become a parent? And I found that raising a child in the US is expensive. really expensive. It costs about $300,000 to raise a child to age 17, and that doesn't include education. If you factor in college, that number jumps to over $400,000.
I was talking to my buddy Emmanuel, and he's got this saying. He says, every kid you decide to have costs you a Rolls Royce, $400,000, if you are intending to put them through school. The other thing about that stat is, man, inflation is getting worse and worse and worse over the last couple of years. So if it's $400,000 is what they're projecting right now, by the time your kid is 20 or whatever, you might have really spent $550,000, because inflation really does seem to be charting up and seem to be this kind of persistent issue as well.
Now, just for context, $400,000 invested over the course of 17 years, which is about the same as investing $2,000 a month, means that instead of having a kid, you could end up with $810,000.
Wow!
Parents raising just 2 children until they're the age of 22 would cost them an average of $750,000.
Oh my gosh.
Including the cost of everything, factoring education and a bigger house for a bigger family. That's not even the crazy part.
Oh my
gosh. The crazy part is that those studies were done between the years 2014 and 2017. So factoring inflation since 2017 means that the new estimate would be a lot closer to $1 million.
Oh my
In the US,
gosh.
64% of young adults who are not having as many kids as they'd like to say that it's childcare costs that are the major reason why. Childcare costs are growing at almost twice the rate of inflation. And it's not just an American problem either. It's a global problem.
In the past, this wasn't as big of an issue, I feel like, because families tended to be together in homes or tended to live together. They weren't so spread out across the country. And so, if you're a young couple and you have your kid, it might be like, oh, grandma lives down the street, or oh, grandma lives in our house. She can help out. I've got other people in my family who can help out. You've got different people working different schedules, and so maybe different family members can come and take care of the kids, and you can kind of have all the kids staying with a family member. Where America has increasingly become more individualistic, and people, live in different cities from the rest of their family, chasing economic opportunity, childcare costs is now something that we have to factor in. Because on the flip side, you don't want to just entrust your children with just anybody. You want to pay a little bit more to make sure that your kid's actually going to be with a company or with an individual that you trust as well. Because it's your kid. What's more valuable than that?
In Britain, for example, couples spend over 20% of their salaries on childcare. And I think we can all agree that it's not getting any easier for millennials or Gen Z who are already struggling with student debt, high housing costs, stagnant wages, and record levels of credit card debt. And when I look at the overall big picture of how much the world has changed its mind about having kids in the last 20 years, it blew my mind. Back in 2003, 83% of people said they wanted to be a parent. Fast forward to 2024, and that number dropped to 51%. In Canada, the numbers tell a similar story. In 2001, only 7% of Canadians said they didn't want kids. But by 2022, that number jumped to 34%. So these numbers show that there's a massive cultural shift in how younger generations are thinking about their future. And it makes a lot of sense in a world where job security is no longer guaranteed, where owning a home seems like a dream for so many people, and where potentially the food we consume is impacting our fertility. And it's no wonder more and more people are questioning whether they want to bring a child into this world.
For sure. I feel like Gen Z has come up on a big diet of doomerism. Doomerism being, we were fed from the time that we were kids, oh, you've only got this many years before the planet explodes. We grew up in this information age where the internet sensationalized every headline to make it more terrifying. All of these global issues that in the past people didn't know about. And so now I think a lot of young people, Gen Z folk especially, are looking at this and going, I don't know if I want to be a parent. There's like 100 million things I'm worried about today that past generations didn't have to worry about. And there is a segment of the young people today, I've met them, who sort of view having a kid in this sort of ball and chain fashion of, oh my gosh, it's the worst thing ever to have a kid. I don't want to bring a freaking kid into this world. They view it as the kid is slowing them down, or because they had a traumatic childhood, oh, I don't want to hurt my kid like I was hurt. And I just think that those are kind of maybe short-sighted ways to look at it. I think everybody has the opportunity in life to progress, to have kids, to mature, and hopefully to give their kids more than they had. But I think when you start to look at the economy, which is what we're talking about here, Yo, it's difficult. It is so difficult to afford having kids today. The average person doesn't make an extra million that they can just throw around. And so now you're talking about them having to significantly downgrade their lifestyle to have just one kid, right? Just 2 kids. He said 2 kids right there would cost you an extra million in your lifetime. How many people do you know that have an extra million laying around, or that stack up an extra million over a 20-year time span? Not many people. That's significant. I know I always sound like a broken record on this channel as well when I talk about, the government or older generations, but I look at this and I'm like, yo, Gen Z has not been the ones that are in charge for the last 50, 60, 70 years. That's the government. That's the older generations. We have these structures in place that we're supposed to think about these things, that we're supposed to watch these trends and say, how can we help the rising childcare costs? How can we help all of these rising costs to make it more reasonable for Gen Z to continue to have kids, or for millennials to continue to have kids? Why is the population starting to decline, and why are birth rates going and slowing? I just look at it and I go, this is apparently what they wanted. They wanted societal collapse, because that's where we're headed. If you don't have a birth rate of 2.1, I've heard it said it's 2.2, then you're going to collapse. And it's as simple as that. You just don't have enough people to continue your society. All of our systems are built on this pyramid model where you have a higher birth rate than you have people today. That's how Social Security was devised. So if we don't fix this problem, we are really headed for complete and total collapse of almost all of our welfare systems.
So this brings me to the question, what can we do about this? And there's a lot of different solutions that have been proposed, but not all of them have been super successful. Taiwan, for example, spent over $3 billion trying to encourage higher birth rates, but it didn't really work. France spends around 4% of its GDP on family measures, including tax breaks and childcare benefits, but it also struggles with low fertility rates. Even in countries like Norway, Finland, and Germany, where the government spends tens of thousands of dollars per child on early childhood care, birth rates continue to decline. In the US, unfortunately, parental leave policies are a lot less generous. The United States offers only 12 weeks of unpaid leave, and even then, only 56% of workers are eligible for this leave. Studies also show that women see a drop in earnings after having children, which is known as the motherhood penalty. And this pay gap stays with them for the long term, while men experience a small, short-term dip in their earnings. So if we want more people to have children, we need to create an environment where it's possible to do that without sacrificing career or financial stability for both men and women.
Agreed.
So making this video did kind of make me sad to realize that we're living in a world where less people are choosing to have kids, and the economic consequence of that could be significant. From labor shortages to higher taxes to struggling pension systems and rising healthcare costs, the effects of declining birth rates will continue to affect the world. It's a very complicated problem, and there's no easy solution. But if there's one thing I'd like to leave you with, though, it's this. Remember that watching videos with statistics and surveys is that this is just one snapshot in history. It's just one frame of reference at this moment in time. And that will change, just as it was different 20 years ago. And you might find yourself sometime later in your life changing your priorities about what you want out of life, especially as you eventually gain that freedom, financial independence, and you want to share that with someone else, whether it's with another partner or with your kids.
I hope what he's kind of alluding to at the end there is correct, is that a lot of these people who are dual income, no kid dinks right now, that they'll come around and say, look, I may be 40, but I want to have a couple of kids. I know it's kind of late to get started, but I've got money. I've got the career going for me. I now want to have kids. And hopefully, I really think that's a best case scenario, is that a lot of people want to have kids. It's just getting pushed back. But some of the stats he was talking about earlier say that people are just not interested in having kids right now, that there's about a half of the population as of 2024 that's just not interested in having kids at all. And so I look at that and I go, that is not a good situation to be in. And I think having kids would actually solve a lot of our economic problems, right? You look at the baby boomers and how they came in as such a large generation. They were really able to fuel the economy. There was so much new labor on the market. It led to all of this innovation, all of these new businesses that could be sustained by such a growing population all of a sudden. And a lot of our issues that we're seeing today, like Social Security taking up a bigger and bigger percentage of your paycheck and not being a sustainable system, a lot of that is attributed to there being fewer young people today, right? Our population being in decline. And so the government really needs to get strategic and work fast about, how can we get these birth rates up? How can we get the kids to have kids so that we're not, in a situation like South Korea in a few years where we have less than a 1.0 birth rate. That's nuts.
Nearly every country is due to shrink by 2100. There's little to no doubt that there's like an ongoing fertility crisis. People are choosing to not have babies anymore. From South Korea to the United States to Norway to Taiwan, pretty much every rich country. And you might not think this is a problem, but it is a problem for a few reasons. The reality is that people are living longer than ever at the moment. When people start to live this long, you need new workers to replace the ones that are retiring.
He said that everybody is living to be older, but I just got to clarify, that's not the case in America. Americans are dying younger. After comparing mortality trends from the early 2000s with those of today, researchers found what they called excess deaths had surged among people between 25 and 44. In August 2022, federal health officials released new data showing that across all demographic groups, Americans are dying younger. There's actually a lot of research that shows that American lifespan is starting to now decline. Now, what is that? Is that, the jab, like some people say, is that the, plastics in our food and all the fun stuff that they add to it? Who knows? But America, we're not lasting longer.
In the 1960s, there were 6 people of working age for every retired person. And by 2035, it's expected to be 2 to 1. This is one of those topics where if you ask 5 different people, you'll get 5 completely different answers as to what the reason is. Some people might say it's a cost of living issue. Some people might say that it's to do with declining rates of religion in the world. Some people might blame women's liberation movements, for example. Either way, no matter what people say, they're typically pretty certain that either their experience or their belief is the reason why on a global scale, people aren't having children. I think we can do better than that, because when I see that there's a problem that is affecting Norway, the US, Taiwan, and France, I tell myself that there's got to be like a better answer that we can give, right? Because these countries are completely different.
That's a great point. Different cultures.
In Norway is vastly different to the childcare situation in the US, which is vastly different to the UK. So I feel like we can get a better answer than just this one-line solution of, it's the cost of living. I think we can do better. If you'd asked me, to be honest, like even just a couple of weeks ago, I would have put the blame squarely on the cost of housing. In fact, there's this one chart that lives like in my head.
He's like me for real. That definitely plays a factor. Housing costs. If I have no more money left over after I pay my housing costs, because I got to pay $1,500 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment before utilities, you think I have room for kids? Bro, I would love to have 3, 4, 5 kids, have a big family. You know what I'm talking about? Be able to take good care of all my kids, have, that big table and everything with all the plates at the table. I can't do it. I can't do it on this economy.
What I do find really interesting is like how the narrative has changed around this topic, because a couple of decades ago, overpopulation was all the rage. All of the discussion around the number of people on Earth revolved around the fact that there were too many people, and we have 2 people to blame for this. First of all, we have this dude here. His name is Thomas Malthus, and he is an 18th century economist, and he was the first major figure to really write about this idea of a population boom.
I don't know about Thomas Malthus, but I will say for me, who I heard it from growing up as a Gen Z person, was a bunch of my more liberal professors or liberal teachers in school. I remember my teacher in, I want to say it was maybe 6th grade, talking about, we're headed for overpopulation. There's too many people. The climate is feeling the effects of too many people on the planet. And then I got to college, and I remember having a professor, it's one of the sciencey classes. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. And then just a couple of years later, you're looking at it and you're like, well, actually all the birth rates are in decline. So maybe people are not the problem. Maybe we actually need to have more people in the world.
Even on the other side of the world, in China, these fears of overpopulation promoted China's decision to implement their one-child policy, the whole package of laws and regulations designed to stop Chinese people from having more than one child. If we fast forward to today, those fears were like clearly unfounded. I think most of us understand that food insecurity is a distribution problem and not an agriculture problem. And instead, we've ended up in the situation where underpopulation is the problem. where there are not enough young people. And I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the US specifically, because I think they've got some really interesting factors that paint a different picture of the fertility crisis to the one that you might have in your head at the moment. This is a graph of the US fertility rates, and it's the kind of graph that makes you want to jump to a specific conclusion or a one-line answer as to what's going on here. But the real interesting part of this graph isn't what it looks like now, it's what it looks like when you kind of break it down by demographics. And thankfully, The Economist has done this for me. If we look at birth rate divided by age, we see some really interesting trends. Somewhat surprisingly, the fertility rate amongst women over 30 has actually been steadily rising since the 1990s. However, you might see something else that's quite interesting. Birth rates amongst 15 to 19-year-old women in the US dropped dramatically.
I want to go back here. If you look at the top of the chart, it says 40 is the new 20. And I think that might have more of a clue for us to figure out why birth rates are slowing down than a lot of other data that we've looked at. 40 is the new 20, Why is it that women are waiting until later in life to have kids? I have to say that's definitely got to be economic. Maybe some of that is social, right? I think there's sort of that midlife crisis that happens to a lot of people around 40 where they reevaluate, what is my life? What am I doing? What have I accomplished? What do I mean here? And if you're 35, 40 looking at that and you don't have any kids, you're saying, look, I might just be erased indefinitely, my bloodline, because I stopped it here. You might suddenly look at that and go, you know what, maybe I do want to have kids at 40 years old, 39 years old, whatever that may be. Obviously, economically, things take a little bit longer to get going nowadays with the different generations. It takes a lot longer before you can hopefully buy a house, before you're well into your career, before you have a meaningful title or a meaningful income. And so I look at that and I say, maybe it's going closer to 40 for the birth rate because the economic factors.
Birth rates amongst 15 to 19-year-old women in the US dropped dramatically. The actual figure is 77%. And they actually explain that more than half of the drop in America's total fertility rate is driven by women under 19 choosing to no longer have kids. Around a third of these births would have been unplanned, and the majority of these births would have been on low incomes as well. In the UK, we actually see a similar trend where women at age 20 are having half as many children. Unlike richer women, these young women are not going to compensate by having more kids in the future. And I actually want to take a brief second to have a little aside and talk about the fact that often the most vilified group of people are actually the most important group of people to society. I'm sure you've heard young single mothers described as a burden on society or as lazy. But clearly these women were actually the backbone of the economy. It's an aspect that I feel many people don't actually think about. Obviously, it would be unreasonable to say that the reason that no one is having kids is purely because teen pregnancies are down. The economic aspect of it is clearly important. It's clearly relevant. I don't think it's a coincidence if you look in this graph that the countries that have the lowest fertility rate in Europe, countries like Italy, Spain and Greece, are also the countries with the highest youth unemployment, the countries where young people live with their parents for the longest, and the economy is in the bin, basically. And if you just ask young adults why they're not having kids, a lot of them will say that it's simply because childcare is too expensive. What I do find interesting, though, is that the fertility crisis is one that affects the whole world. And it affects countries that spend an incredible amount of money on social programs for kids. So this is a quote by Robert Reich. If you don't know who Robert Reich is, he was US Secretary of Labor. He says that Norway spends around $30,000 per child on early childhood care. Finland spends $23,000. Germany spends $18,000, and the US spends $500 per child. Obviously, the US has a huge childcare spending problem. It just doesn't want to invest in young children.
Bro, the US has got a lot of problems, right? And this is sort of my problem with this sort of capitalism worship that we see in the United States, where everybody cares about the almighty dollar, their investments, their retirement, shareholders, et cetera, et cetera. Capitalism is worshipped in the United States. But here's my thing. Capitalism is our best economic system, but it's clearly not perfect, right? If you've got a population that's in decline and you have a group of people that are willing to have kids, maybe multiple kids, to help solve that problem, but they're scared because financially they can't afford it and there's no sort of societal structure to help them pay for childcare or to help them have kids, which is good for society's benefit, then your system of capitalism as it exists is clearly pretty flawed. right? Like, I don't think it's asking too much to say, hey, maybe we should look at our systems and figure out how we can engineer them to keep human beings alive and keep human beings from completely dying off as a species. Because that's where we're headed, for serious population decline. And it's only going to get worse the lower that birth rates get, because there's going to be fewer people to support the people retiring in the future. And that's not a system that a lot of people are going to want to work for or that are going to want to play into. It's not going to look good down the road. So when you look at a stat like this that says the United States only spends $500 on early childhood care, yes, that's concerning, but I look at it and go like, forget early childhood care. What do we do throughout the duration of a child's life to make it, enticing for somebody to have kids that wants to have kids, for a responsible person who wants to be a parent to be a parent? Because even after they get out of early childhood, let's say the kid is 15 and mom and dad get laid off in a bad economy, and that kid's got something, he needs to go to the hospital, very easily can that child bankrupt a family because healthcare costs are unaffordable. So I look at the system of capitalism in the United States, and once again I go, look, it's the best economic system that we've got, but we can't just leave it. We've got to figure out something, because clearly it's not working the way that y'all say it's working. It's not working. Healthcare costs through the roof, childcare costs through the roof, housing costs through the roof, population of the United States in decline, the rest of the world too. But we got to figure out something different. You don't look at a problem and say, well, we're in a problem, but I worship our current solution so much that I'm going to keep doing the same thing over and over again. That's what we call insanity, trying to do the same thing over and over and over again and expecting different results. Clearly, we need some sort of change in our system. And I'm not saying we should do away with capitalism, but I'm saying, shareholder capitalism as it exists today, where we only care about the shareholder, the investor, we only care about the CEOs protecting the actual companies, you're not going to have much of an economy in 50 years because you guys are so short-sighted in this whole economic system. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Mitchell. Check out one of these other videos, maybe hit subscribe. I appreciate you guys for watching. God bless. Have a good one.